Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to show you how to set up your MiSTer FPGA to access games over a network attached storage with a Raspberry Pi. And to help us with this, we're going to be using the Open Media Vault software. Now let me first talk about the requirements we need for this. Links and suggestions to needed items in this video will be in the description. Obviously, we're going to need a Raspberry Pi. From what I've read, the minimum Raspberry Pi that Open Media Vault supports is a Raspberry Pi 2. Newer ones will obviously give you better performance. You also want to install the Raspberry Lite software onto an empty SD card. You will also need an empty USB drive that you will attach to the Raspberry Pi. And this USB drive will be what's going to store the games that the MiSTer FPGA will access. Remember to use a USB drive that you want to erase. In this tutorial, all data will be wiped off from that drive. You also need to download some scripts from the MiSTer FPGA GitHub. These scripts will mount and unmount the necessary folders that we will create on the network attached storage. Okay, so let's begin. The first thing you need to do is install Open Media Vault on the Raspberry Pi. I'm not going to show you how to do this. What I'm going to do is point you to an excellent video tutorial or article that shows you how to do this. It's at pimylifeup.com. And if you follow these instructions, you'll have Open Media Vault installed shortly. Once you have Open Media Vault installed, attach the USB drive that you're going to use to the Raspberry Pi, preferably to the USB 3.0 port on the Pi. Those are the USB ports that are colored blue. Plug in the Raspberry Pi to power and to your network router, and when it finishes booting, you can access your Pi through the IP address that was assigned to it. So here I am on the Open Media Vault opening page. The default username and password for Open Media Vault is admin for the username and Open Media Vault for the password. So I'll log in. And then you'll be greeted to the dashboard. The first thing you will want to do is change the admin password. So you do that by clicking on this user settings icon and then click on change password. Type the new password you want to use and you confirm it and then click save. Once that's done, you may want to change the host name of the Raspberry Pi. For instance, I have mine called games.local. This will allow you to access the Raspberry Pi without typing the IP address. So to change this, what you want to do is go to Network, then General, and you can type the host name you want and the domain name you want. In this page, the domain name is required, but use whatever you like. Save when you're done. And now we're ready to actually set up shared folders. Okay, so let's set up the storage that we connected to the Raspberry Pi first. Let's do that by going to Storage and then Disks. Here we see my SD card. We don't want to touch that. And here, this is the USB drive that I connected. It's a 32 gigabyte drive. And this is what I want to set up to store my games in. So we want to erase this drive first before it could be usable. I'll click on it to do that, and then click the Erase/Wipe button up here. I'll choose Quick Erase and let it do its thing. Okay, once the erase is done, we want to set up the file system. To do that, go to Storage again, click File Systems, click the plus button. Let's use ext4. On the device drop-down here, I'm going to select my USB drive, then click Save, and let it do its thing. It completed, I'll close, and now I'm taken to the Mount page. We can also get to this Mount page by going to Storage, File Systems, and click the Play/Mount button. Okay, so we want to mount the file system we just created. Let's click on this file system dropdown and select our USB drive again. You can see that has been formatted in ext4. Then let's click save. We get this alert telling us that there are pending configuration changes. Just click the apply checkbox, and then click yes. Okay, so the file system is now set up. The next step is to set up a shared folder. To do that, let's go to storage again, and then click on shared folders. Click on the plus button. Now think about the name of the folder you want to use. I want this folder to be called games because it's going to mimic the games folder on a MiSTer FPGA SD card. On the file system, let's select the file system we created. Here it is. The relative path automatically takes up the name that we set up here. You could change it to whatever you want, but I'm going to leave it as is. I'm also going to leave the permissions as is too. Now I'll click save, and we get the pending configuration changes alert again. Just hit the checkbox to apply the changes, and then click yes again here. Now on the shared folders page, we see the shared folder we created. Okay, so now let's go to the next step. On the MiSTer FPGA, I'm going to be using the Samba protocol in order to access the shared folder here. However, Samba is not enabled in Open Media Vault by default, so we're going to have to set up Samba here. And to do that, we go to Services, SMB/CIFS, Settings, and we want to check Enabled. I'll leave everything else as is and click Save. Again, we get the pending configurations changes alert. I'll click Apply and yes. Okay, so Samba is now enabled. However, the shares we created before are not available via Samba. We need to create some separate Samba shares. And to do that, again, we go to Services, SMB/CIFS, Shares. Let's click on the plus button here. Make sure this checkbox is checked. Click on the shared folder dropdown and select the Samba share we created. I'll leave everything else as is and click Save. Again, with the alert, apply it and then click Yes. Okay, so now shares are all set up. However, I don't want to use the admin user in order to access these games on the MiSTer FPGA. So I want to create a separate user just for the MiSTer FPGA to access these games. So to create a user, I am going to go to the user page and then click users again. And here I'm shown all the users on the Raspberry Pi. Right now, it only has the initial user I created when setting up the SD card. But like I said before, I don't want to use this user to access games from the MiSTer FPGA. So let's create a new user. I'll click the plus button here, click create. The name of the user I'm going to use is called Retro. I'll skip email and use a password of Retro. You can use whatever username or password you want. I'll confirm the password. Leave everything else as is and click Save. As always, we'll get a pending configuration changes alert. So I'll apply it and hit yes. So now we're done with the Open Media Vault server now. It is ready to be accessed from the MiSTer FPGA. But I want to set up some folders on the shared folder I created. And I'll do that by basically copying the contents of the games folder on a MiSTer FPGA card onto the games share I created. So let me get my MiSTer FPGA SD card now. Okay, so I plugged in my MiSTer FPGA SD card to my computer, and here it is. So what I'm going to do is copy the contents of this folder, games, onto the network share. Now's a good time to show you how to access the network share from a Windows computer. You can do that by opening a folder and then on this address bar, type / / and the IP address of your Raspberry Pi server. Enter the username and password you created. Mine was retro and retro. And then I see the shared folder I created, which was called games. So I'll click on it, and it's empty. So what I'm going to do is copy all these folders here, which are all the folders inside the games folder on the SD card, on the MiSTer FPGA SD card. I'll select all of them and drag them here. And I'll wait until it's finished. Well, in the meantime, let me show you how to access the shared folder on a Mac computer. Okay, so here I am logged in remotely to my Mac laptop. And to access the server from here, I would click on, you want to be completely on the desktop/Finder, not with an application in the foreground. When you're on the Finder, you get these menus up here. You want to click on the Go menu option, then click Connect to Server, and then type smb:// and the IP address of your Raspberry Pi. And then click Connect. Type the username and password you created on the Raspberry Pi. For me is retro and retro. Click Connect. And the shared folder appears. It looks like all the folders were copied. And yes, the copying is complete. So these folders don't have any games on them. The next step would be just to copy whatever games you want into whatever folder. So if you want some Amiga games in here, copy Amiga games into the Amiga folder. If you want some Genesis games, copy some Genesis games onto the Genesis folder, NES games onto the NES folder, Neo Geo games onto the Neo Geo folder, and so on and so on. I'm going to go ahead and do that now behind the scenes. And then I'm going to show you how to configure the MiSTer FPGA to access this shared folder. Okay, so I showed you how to prepare the Raspberry Pi shared folder to have the same directory structure as the games folder on a MiSTer FPGA SD card. But let's also say you want to share saves and save states across multiple MiSTer FPGAs on your network. That is possible, but you must set the folder structure differently than what we're doing now, and also the MiSTer FPGA must be configured differently. If you want to do this, you must think carefully on how to do this, because if you have multiple MiSTer FPGAs on your network and you share them with multiple people, it can be very easy for someone to overwrite your save or save state. So make sure you really want to do this. If you do, let me show you how. This is completely optional, so if you don't want to share saves and save states, you can go ahead and skip to the next section. So we're going to change how the folders are structured here on the SD card. First, let's create a new folder here. Let's call it games. I'll do it lowercase games. Then let's copy all the game system folders onto this game folders. And we're working on the Raspberry Pi right now. Okay, so we have a games folder here. Now we can decide which folders on the main directory of a MiSTer FPGA SD card that we also want to mount over the network. And here on this window, this is my MiSTer FPGA connected over a network. And the folders I want to mount from here are the saves and save states folders. You can choose other folders you want to mount, except the Linux folder and the config folder. You can mount other folders that you want, but me personally, I just want to do the saves and save states folder. So let's go back to the Raspberry Pi and let's create two new folders. I'll create a folder for saves and a folder for save states. So later on, when I configure the MiSTer FPGA, it will mount this games folder. So of course, go to this location to find games over the network. It will also mount this saves folder. So of course, go to this directory over the network to find game saves. And it will mount the save states folders over the network. So of course, go to this directory to find save states. and it will bypass the local directories on the MiSTer FPGA. Okay, so we're done here, so let's continue on. Okay, so the next step is to configure your MiSTer FPGA to access this shared folder we created. We first need to download some scripts from the MiSTer FPGA GitHub. And this is the link. I'll provide everything in the description that you need. Once you're in this page, you scroll down and download these two scripts, CIFS underscore mount.sh and CIFS underscore unmount.sh. Okay, so here I have those two scripts in my downloads folder. What we want to do now is create a copy of the mount.sh script and rename it to CIFS underscore mount.ini. And the reason we're doing this is to use this ini file to restore the settings that access the shared folder. That way, if this .sh script is ever updated and then you drag it in, you don't accidentally erase all the settings. So let's open up this CIFS underscore mount.ini file. Here's the file. Let's first scroll to where you see code starts here. Select everything underneath it and delete it because we won't need it for this file. Save it. And now let's change some settings. Let's first go to the server option. And in the quotes, type the IP address of your server. You can also change this to instead of using an IP address, you can also use the host name and domain name you chose. Remember at the beginning where I said where you can change that? Mine was games.local. I can demonstrate this here. If I type games.local here, the Raspberry Pi connection will show up. And if I type games.local, I can also access the Raspberry Pi like that. So yeah, so you can either use the host name and domain name, or you can use the IP address. If you use an IP address, make sure that your router is set to always use the same IP address for the Raspberry Pi and not to change. That's called a static IP address. You don't want it to use a dynamic IP address. Since I have my Raspberry Pi set to a static IP address, I'll use the IP address. On the share name, I'll name this to the share I created on the Raspberry Pi, which was called games. Then I'll scroll down to the username, which is retro. Remember, use the username that you created. And the password I created was retro. And I'll leave this as is right now. However, depending on your configuration, you may want to turn on this mount at boot set it to true. That way, the MiSTer FPGA will automatically mount the shared folder every time you boot it up. However, there are some issues with this mount at boot function. If you're using Wi-Fi, there are certain Wi-Fi adapters that will basically not work with this and will make your Wi-Fi stop working. I experienced this with the Wi-Fi adapter I have. I read on the MiSTer FPGA forums that the Wi-Fi adapter that Taki Udon uses suffered from this issue also. So if you're using Wi-Fi, you may not want to enable this. I'll provide a link in the description that discusses this issue on the MiSTer FPGA forums. I'm going to be using Wi-Fi, so I'm going to leave this as false. Okay, so this configuration is done. I'll save the file. Okay, so the previous configuration I showed you was only mounting the games folder. If you want to mount other folders like the save and save states folders. Let me show you how. First, make sure you're using the same settings in this INI I just told you in the previous section. Then you want to scroll down to the local underscore DII variable, and then delete this text and put an asterisk instead. You also want to check this variable here, single CIFS connection, and make sure that is set to true. Then save, and you're done with the configuration. Now we have 3 files we want to copy onto the MiSTer FPGA. We have 2 scripts called CIFS underscore mount.sh and CIFS underscore unmount.sh. And then also we have the INI file we created. Now we want to copy these 3 files onto the scripts folder on your MiSTer FPGA SD card. So I'll select them and drag them to the scripts folder. And now they're ready to be executed on the MiSTer FPGA. So I'm going to eject this SD card from my computer and attach it to the MiSTer FPGA. And let's go to my MiSTer FPGA right now. Okay, so here I am on my MiSTer FPGA, and I'm ready to mount the share folder I created on the Raspberry Pi onto here. But first, let me show you a core where I have no games installed for on the SD card. Right now, the MiSTer is not connecting to the Raspberry Pi over the network. It's just going to read games off the built-in SD card. So let me show that real quickly. I'll go to Console, Turbo Duo. And if I go to Insert CD, it's empty. Now, if I run the mount script, when I come back to this folder here, you will see some games. But since I didn't mount the shared folder from the Raspberry Pi, you don't see anything here. So let me run that script now so it can mount the folder. I'll reboot. Okay, from here to mount that, we go to scripts, and then we run CIFS underscore mount. I run that, and it tells me that CIFS is mounted, and to press any key to continue. I'll do that. Now, when I go back to the console core, to the Turbo Duo core, and go to Insert CD, we see some games now. This is over Wi-Fi, mind you. So now let me run a game. I'll run this one. Okay, I'll start. And now let's begin the game. And I'm playing a game over the network, over Wi-Fi. You should get better performance over a direct Ethernet connection, but that should only really apply to CD-ROM games and also probably the AO486 core where it uses a hard drive. But even then, I still got decent performance over Wi-Fi. My experience has been that Ethernet is faster than the SD card. The SD card is slower than Ethernet, and Wi-Fi is at the bottom. But that could depend on the Wi-Fi technology that you use and the adapter. I have Wi-Fi 7, but I don't think the MiSTer FPGA Wi-Fi adapter I'm using is... No, I don't have Wi-Fi 7, I'm sorry, I have Wi-Fi 6. But I don't even think the MiSTer FPGA wireless adapter I'm using is Wi-Fi 6. It's probably less. But since, these are old retro games, so I don't think you're losing too much over Wi-Fi if you want that convenience. The reason I'm not using Ethernet, because on this specific MiSTer FPGA setup that I'm using now, the router is pretty far away, so and I don't want to run a long Ethernet cable to it. But Wi-Fi suffices. Okay, now let me show you what happens with the i9 configuration that mounts multiple folders, like the games folder, the saves, and save states folder. Let me go to the scripts menu, and then I'll mount. Okay, and here now you see that it mounted the games folder, the saves folder, and the save states folder. So every time I load up, let me exit here. So every time I load up a core and load a game that supports saves, the save files will now be stored on the network and not on the local MiSTer FPGA. And the same goes for save states. If I load up the NES core and save a save state, that save state will be stored on the network and not the local MiSTer FPGA. If I mount those same folders on another MiSTer FPGA setup I have on my network, then it will load the same saves and save states with it. Let me demonstrate that. Here I am on my MiSTer FPGA with an IP address that ends in 137. So let's demonstrate this with the NES core because I know it supports save states. The core is loaded. Let me load a game. I'll load Castlevania. And let me wait until the attract mode comes up where I'll save a state and load that state on another MiSTer FPGA. Okay, so let me go here and save the state. So I rebooted the NES core and I'm now going to load Final Fantasy. This is a game that supports backup saves. I'm going to select continue because this is the first time that I'm running the game, and when you select continue on your first run, it's going to act the same as selecting a new game. That way you can see the difference when I go to my other MiSTer FPGA and I select continue, it's not going to do a new game. So let me select continue. I'll name all my characters. Then I'll go into town and sleep at an inn. This is going to save my game when I sleep at an inn. And also, let me check my gold. I have 400 gold. And also reduce my gold. So we can see the gold reduction on our other save when we go to the other MiSTer FPGA. Select yes, so the gold will go down by 30. Okay, so when we go to my other MiSTer FPGA, we will see that I have 370 gold. Remember, nothing has been saved at all onto the network or the SD card because the only time the MiSTer FPGA saves battery backup is when you bring up the menu. So if I bring up the menu, you see that they're saving. If I would have shut down, I would have lost all the progress I made. But now that I open up the menu and you see that saving alert, we know that the battery backup was saved. It's something that you always have to pay attention with the MiSTer FPGA. Now I'll shut down and go to my other MiSTer FPGA. But before I go to my other MiSTer FPGA, let me show you the save states and save files that were created on the network. Here I am on my computer accessing my Raspberry Pi remotely. You can see I have my games folder where it will store all my games for the MiSTer FPGA to load. But let's see the files that it created on the saves and save states. If I go to the saves folder into NES, you can see that there's a Final Fantasy save file. This is the battery backup RAM that's stored on the network. I go back to this folder here and go inside save states. Inside NES, we have the Castlevania save state file. Now we see that files are being created on the network that store the saves and save states. Now I'll actually take you to my other MiSTer FPGA. Okay, so here I am on my other MiSTer FPGA setup, and it's connected over Ethernet. Let me show you its IP address. This one ends in 115, and the other one I showed you ends in 137. So let's load the NES core to see if, wait, first I'll have to mount the script. I use the same configuration here as on my other MiSTer FPGA for the CIFS _ mount script. So let me run that. And you can see that the games folder is mounted, the saves folder is mounted, and the save states folder is mounted. Now let me load up the NES core. I'll first load up Castlevania, and let me load the save state. Restore save state. And you can see it continued right where I left off from my other MiSTer FPGA. So I rebooted the NES core. Now let me load up Final Fantasy. So if I select continue now, we will continue from where we last left off on my MiSTer FPGA. I should also be having 370 gold on my inventory. So I'll click continue. So yeah, we didn't get the character selection. And now let's check our gold. 370. So the network saves are working. Anyway, that's how you set up the MiSTer FPGA for accessing games over the network. Let me know what you think about this video in the comments. So thanks for watching, and I'll speak to you next time.